Hello, I'm Mark and welcome to my shop. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Stanley 444 dovetail plane. It's this plane that's laid out in front of me here on the bench. I have a kit here that's complete. I'll go through the parts of the plane and the pieces that you should look for if you're out in the marketplace trying to collect one of these planes. I'll talk about the parts that could go missing, those that you should definitely look for to make sure that they're there. And then after I do that, I'll actually set up the plane, show you how the plane is set up, which is not intuitive or easy, and then I'll put the plane to work and I'll actually make a sample dovetail joint. I'll give you some tips and tricks that I've kind of figured out in my month or so with this plane trying to get it to work. So if you're interested in the Stanley 444 sliding dovetail plane, I hope you find this video instructional. I'm going to zoom in the camera here a little bit and we're going to go over the pieces and the parts of the plane next. Thanks. Okay, let's go ahead and cover the pieces and the parts of the Stanley 444 dovetail plane. The plane typically came in a box, and sometimes it's a cardboard box. This is an old chestnut box. It's in good condition. The box in general you would think is nice to have, not necessary, and that's true. Although on my box, on the inside of the lid, are some very helpful diagrams that we'll refer to later. Inside the box, the plane itself has a main casting. This is the main casting and the main part of the plane. When we're looking for this piece of the plane, I'll talk about some of the pieces that might be missing and those that you'd want to keep an eye out for. There's also a bevel fence, which is this fence here, sets up at an angle. A square fence, this one here that goes to the plane, so the two fences. Spur blocks, which are these two pieces here, and we'll talk about the spur blocks in just a moment. A screwdriver that Stanley supplied, two short rods, 4 irons that came with the plane of various widths, the box that the irons came in, a little gauge to show you what the sample joint should look like, and then inside the kit there was a set of instructions. This is this early kit. They're not very long, it's just front and back, a little pamphlet here. Not particularly helpful, by the way, when you're using the plane. The instructions are a little bit brief, kind of like something you get from China these days. It just tells you very little about how to actually use the plane. And then in the kit itself, there would have been a pamphlet that would just have had other Stanley tools for sale. Obviously not necessary, but it was a part of the kit that came out with these planes. So that's the complete setup here. Let's talk about pieces and parts that might go missing or things to look for when you're out searching for this plane. So we'll start with the main housing. Not too much here. You'll probably find this complete. You want to make sure you have the thumb screw here. It is a bit elongated, and this is to go ahead and lock the blade in when it's in place. So you want to make sure the thumb screw is in place. Then this knob is incredibly important to the function of the plane. You want to make sure that it's on there. It shouldn't come off. There's no reason to take it off, but there is a screw on the back side of the plane that regulates the depth of this knob, and if you took that off for some reason, it might be missing. There's a couple of spurs on this plane, so here and here, spurs are knickers. So you want to make sure that the screws there, the knickers in place. This is going to help with the quality of cut. This one over here is actually not set to cut into the wood and only would be used with the narrowest blade. Otherwise, this is going to be tucked out of the way and not used. So those are the parts of the main casting. I imagine these are fairly complete most of the time. Let's go over next to this bevel fence. So on the bevel fence, there's just a couple of pieces and parts to look for. One is these two thumb screws. You want to make sure that they're present. They're going to lock in the fence rods. If you don't have these thumb screws, you could probably scavenge some from other Stanley planes like the 45 or 55. But otherwise, you want to make sure that they're here. Probably the most important piece of this fence that would go missing is this right here. This is a depth gauge, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit to make it easier to see that. So this is a depth gauge. It sets and regulates the depth of cut when you're using this plane. And this gauge slides up and down here on this thumb screw. And there's a thumb screw, a washer, and then this little gauge. To set this plane on the fence, it's kind of easy to take off this depth gauge, unscrew it all the way, take it out of the way, put the fence on the plane, and then put this back on. If you do, you set these parts aside, and you may forget to put them back on later, especially after you take this fence off. I could see setting these aside and missing them. So this is a depth gauge. It just kind of slides on the thumb screw. And I imagine this goes missing fairly often. And if it's not here, the plane will not work. The plane will not work without this gauge. There's no way to get it to work without this gauge being on it. It's an integral part of the plane. The square fence, the only moving piece, is a similar depth gauge. Now you only use one depth gauge at a time, so if you have one between the two fences, you probably get away with it. But you want to make sure that you do have at least one depth gauge. When Stanley issued this, each plane would have a depth gauge. Again, plane will not work without this depth gauge. The Stanley screwdriver is nice, but we don't really need it. The other piece to kind of look for is this spur block. There's two. They're of different widths. And the purpose of the spur block, as we'll see, is just this little nicker right here that's on the plane. As we set this up, we'll see the purpose of this. But that's the purpose of the spur block. There was two. They often go missing. And then these are held on by these small screws here. And you actually have to take the screws off to put the spur block on the plane and then screw the screws back in, which is fine when you're setting up the plane. You're not going to lose them. But then you take the spur block off to do the last part of the cut and set it aside. And I imagine when people take the spur blocks off, they lose these screws, and there's some kind of weird Stanley thread. Without these screws, you can't attach the spur block. So look for the blocks themselves, but also make sure they have these screws. Otherwise, you're going to be in the marketplace for some very odd Stanley-specific screws, and that will be hard to find. Again, the short rods, they could be short because we don't really have to adjust the fence to that much of a depth. You could probably scavenge something simpler off a 45 or 55 plane. The plane came with 4 irons of different sizes and width. You could probably get away with the widest and this blade here or this blade here. So you could probably get away with 2 blades, but for a complete kit, you'd want all 4. The irons or the blades came in a box, so nice to have the box. There's also a setup angle on this box right here that helps you set the bevel of the blade when you're sharpening. There's also a mention of the bevel here in the instructions, so you could obviously scribe your own line on a piece of wood to make a setup block for yourself when sharpening these jigs. But it's a nice thing to have. The setup block is purely cosmetic, no function. But that's overall the pieces and the parts of the plane. Again, look for the spur blocks, these set screws, and really keep an eye out for these depth gauges because the plane won't work without it. Those are the pieces and parts of the Stanley 444 plane. Let's go ahead and set this plane up next for use to cut dovetail joint and 3/4 inch stock. Okay, we're going to go ahead and set up the plane for the cut across our stock here. So this is going to be for the cut, the groove that goes across the stock that the tail will slide into. So we're going to make a cut, or we're going to set up the plane to make this cut that goes across. And to do that, we're going to need the main housing of the plane, the bevel fence, the smaller of the 2 spur blocks, and the 7/16 inch blade. And then we'll need a screwdriver to put it all together. So we've got our pieces here. Let's talk about the setup. The easiest thing to do first is to set up or put on the spur block. So when I got the plane for the first time, and I'd seen these in the past, my thought was always on this spur block that this point must cut something. It looks pointy and sharp, so I probably cut something. And that's what I thought the spur block did. That is completely wrong. That is not at all what the spur block does. What the spur block actually does is widen the sole of the plane. It will widen the sole of the plane to accommodate the iron. So let's go ahead and see how that sets up. So first thing we do is we take these 2 small screws out of the spur block, and then we're going to roll this plane over onto this side here. And and go ahead and line this up. There we go. And that's how it sits on here. And you can actually see the curve of this is not to cut, but to match the curve that's in the plane itself. So we get that set into place. and then we flip the plane over, and the screws actually come in from this side. So 1 and 2 screws, and then we'll go ahead and tighten those down into place. There we go. 1. And 2. All right, so that's now tightened into place, and you can see what we've done is we've widened the sole of the plane here. And when we take and we move the iron into place, which we'll do next, you can see what this does is that now the sole of the plane matches the width of the iron, and there's a nicker or a spur on this side of the cut, and because we put this block on, there's now a nicker or a spur on this side of the cut. And that is the purpose of the spur block, is just to get a spur over here. Why is it shaped like it is? To match this chip opening in the plane. That is the only reason it's shaped the way that it is. So that's the way that it fits in here. All right, we're going to go ahead and lock down this iron next, or this cutter. Now this is a molding plane, so this is not a fine smoothing plane. We're going to want to hog out some material here, so we want to make this a fairly aggressive cut. It's a little bit proud right now, but as we dial in the cut, we don't want this to be too fine. We want this to make a pretty aggressive cut across the grain of the wood following these 2 spurs. So that's the next piece, is to set this iron in place and get it set up at approximately the right depth. As I get over to the stock, I'll make sure that it's at the right depth. I can adjust the iron once it's in the stock, but really the only way to adjust the iron is to loosen the thumb screw back up and then manually move the iron up and down. So there's no fine adjustment on this plane at all. It's just a manual move up and down of the iron. It's a little bit tough to get in there because your fingers are often cramped, which is true a lot with this plane, but that's the way it would be adjusted. So we'll do that as we get over to the stock. And then the third part of this setup is to attach this fence. And when I first got the fence, I could not figure out when I first got the plane, I could not figure out for the life of me how to get this on here, because this knob that it slides over was actually too tight. And the depth of this knob is regulated by that screw. And it took me a while to figure that out. Not covered in the instructions at all. So you want this knob out just far enough to allow this fence to slip over and onto the plane. And let's see if we can get it to do that. There we go. It slips over and onto the plane. And that's essentially how we start to set this up. Now, this is a depth gauge. We talked about it earlier. And this depth gauge is going to regulate how deeply we allow the plane to cut into the wood. And for 3/4 inch stock, what Stanley suggests, and it's covered here in diagrams on this box top, what they suggest is that the depth of cut for this first cut is 3/8 of an inch. And I found that to be a pretty reasonable cut. So that's what we want to set this up at. So the scale is set up here in eighths. So we can go 0, 1/8, 2/8. There's my 3/8. So I want to go ahead and set that to 3/8. And we'll need to make sure that's fairly accurate, because later on we're going to have to match that 3/8 inch cut if we want a tight dovetail groove fit. So 3/8 inch on the scale. And this is essentially the plane setup for the first cut. Now, I made that look easy. It's not covered in detail in the instructions. The instructions, which are back in the box over here, just say attach the fence. And they don't give you very much more than that. So it took a while to figure all that out. But that's the way you set up the plane. We'll tighten the blade down, make sure the depth of cut is good, and then we'll go over and start making the cut. One of the things I want to point out is the way this plane works before we go over there, though, which is you see this fence is still loose. And that is actually how this functions. This plane functions with this fence being loose. And it will slide up and down to regulate the depth of cut. This is what determines how deeply this plane cuts. So this fence acts as a guide and as a depth of cut indicator. So it does both. It's kind of odd. Because you have metal on metal mating surfaces here, I've put a liberal amount of paste wax on both surfaces to regulate the slide up and down. for that cut. You can see it's still a little bit loose here in swinging back and forth. So we want to be careful about that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get over to the stock. But that's the setup. And then this plane is going to ride across the wood to cut that groove. Up next, we'll take some stock here. We'll mark it. We'll go over to a fixture that I've set up to help me hold the stock as I make the cut. And we'll go ahead and make this cut, this groove cut, in this piece of wood. And then we'll come back and change the plane over and make the matching tail cut. All right, I'm going to show you now how to make the first cut with this Stanley plane. When I set out to make this video, I said I want to make a quality dovetail joint with this plane. I've seen a few other videos of the 444. Most of them aren't too detailed, and most of them conclude with a pretty poor quality cut, and people kind of give up on the plane, put it back on the shelf. I actually wanted to put this plane in use in a way that you could use it in a shop if you wanted to do that and get a good quality finished result. So I built a fixture to help me do that. I'm going to show you the fixture, why I built it the way that I built it, kind of step through the purpose of the cut. You don't need to do all of this to make a cut with a 444, but if you don't do something similar to this, your quality of cut's not going to be very good. So I'm going to walk you through the fixture, the process of using the plane, first to make this dado cut, then we'll go back, switch the plane over, and come back and make the tail cut. I can't promise you you're going to like this methodology, but it will work, and we will get a good joint out of it. Okay, here it is, my Stanley 444 dovetail plane fixture version 1. Let me talk to you a little bit about this fixture and why I set it up this way. Number one is it's secured into the tail vise of my bench, so it's nice and secure, it's not going to move. It's a 3/4 inch piece of stock with some T-track screwed down to the top of it, and then some spacer boards to bring it all flat and level. The T-track is going to help me move this fence here, and it'll also give me place to apply some hold downs and some clamps to hold the stock into place. What Stanley recommends is when you get your piece of stock and you're getting ready to cut across, go ahead and tack a batten board down. So basically you would take a piece of wood, some nails, and tack it into your stock, and that's what you would use to actually make the cut across the grain to guide, and what that will do is guide this fence. Well, there's a couple problems with that are obvious. Number one is if you use nails to tack a batten board into your piece of finished stock, you're going to have nail holes when you pull it out, and you're going to have to fill them in. Not great for a quality piece of work. The other one is, and you're going to see this, we're going to be moving this fence, this batten board, to either side of the cut and kind of moving the stock around. To get a good quality cut, you really need to do that. So having something that's permanently tacked into place with nails that you have to pull out and then re-nail and pull out and re-nail, it's not really going to work out well for us. So I built this little fixture here, and what it has to help me out, this is my batten board. This is going to be my fence. This will be what the plane rides along. I can adjust it to make sure that I get it square with this cut. This block is over here just to help me hold the stock into place, because I'm going to push this way. It's going to create great lateral pressure. And that's essentially what we're going to do. We're going to run the plane across the stock. Now let's talk about marking out that cut. Stanley, I pull my box top here, gives us some dimensions for this cut. Remember I said for 3/4 inch stock, they said 3/8 inch deep for the cut. That's what they recommended that we do. They also recommend that this groove, this dado, at its narrowest point at the top where we mark the lines, is 7/16 inches. That's what they recommend here, 7/16 inches. And what I found is that with this iron being 7/16 inches, you really gum up the top of the cut if you're trying to stick within those narrow parameters of 7/16. So I've also found that as you kind of cut down on one side, you don't have a good place to get started on the shoulder of the other side of the cut. Through experimentation, I found that not following the Stanley instructions and giving yourself an extra 1/16 of an inch will actually pay off. So this right now is a 1/2 inch at the width of the top of the cut. Now, if you didn't notice the instructions on the top of the box, or they weren't included in your instruction sheets that came with it, you would be at a loss, because Stanley's instructions with this plane simply say draw a line across and draw another parallel line. You don't know how wide your joint is. So here we have a detailed measurement here, 1/2 inch. And then we use just a square and a marking knife to score deep lines to help us guide the cut and also help us get a good quality at the top here so we don't have a lot of chip out. Even though we have spur blocks, Stanley still recommends a marking knife to cut across here. All right, so let's go ahead and get the stock in the fixture and get it ready for the cut. So the reason I have a block here and a block here is this is going to slide across the top of the stock like so. And we've got a couple of considerations. One is I have found that as you run this plane across, as you come out on the back side, there's a big risk of tear out on the back of this cut. So I've made several of just thin stock that's the same thickness as my final product here, and I'm going to use this as a backer board for the cut. Make sure that I have a piece of it that's showing. This will also help me line things up. I've also made a little spacer block here. That's the width of the fence to help me set up this jig. So I can kind of go ahead and put things in here. Now this one is just tightened down. It's just to hold the back end of the stock. But I'm going to bring this fence over, line up my spacer block, and then I could clamp this clamp down and get this exactly where I want it on the front side. There we go. A little bit more. And clamp this side down. You can see this is why I kind of made this the version of my setup jig so that the pieces can independently move so I can get the exact setup that I want. And that is still not quite right, so I'm going to just adjust that a hair more. Move this one out just a touch. Make sure we're parallel and square all the way across. Just a little bit more. There we go. Okay, clamp that down. All right, so we've got that parallel, and we'll leave this block here because the next piece of this is to hold down the stock a little bit. And I've come up with various hold downs going to help me do this. Now, this is one that seems to work pretty well. Again, we're going to put a lot of lateral force on this cut, so we want to get that locked in here, and that's the advantage of the T-track. I have other fixtures that I might use. This is one that I could use on wider stock, or other hold downs, I'm sorry, that I could use in the fixture, but this is the one that seems to work best. So I've got my, and there it goes, it moved just a bit. Got my fences lined up. There we go. Got my stock lined up. Everything's in there. I got a backer board here for the cut. And now I could bring over the Stanley Plane. And the way that we're going to do this, we got to keep this fence tight to the batten board. So that's step A. And then we got to run this across smoothly and let the iron cut. And it's going to go into my backer board here. And just to help with that, let's go ahead and extend our marking lines right here. And right here, across that sacrificial piece. And we're going to run this plane across, and we're going to have to keep this square. Holding this plane is awkward. So there's a little push block here. You got to have one hand on this fence. You got to have another hand here. We're going to run across, and there we go. We've made our first cut across here, right on the score line of this cut. And so we'll just go ahead and continue to do that. Okay, now I'm going to stop for a second. I've got this line marked pretty well, and I'm starting down my depth of cut, and I've got plenty of room in here, and I've still got a little shoulder for the other cut. Now, what I found is, as I get started here, I want to start giving the other side of this cut some relief before I get too far down on this one, because otherwise this plane will start getting bung up in the cut. So I'm going to go down a little bit, and it looks like I've got my stock moving over here a little bit, so I'm going to go get another clamp. Okay, we've added another little piece to our fixture back here to hold the stock in place. Example of why we need some fixture like this to hold the stock down. It's kind of awkward, so we've got that back in place, and we can continue to make our cut here across the stock. Okay, so we're getting a good start here. We're up to one of the score lines, and we're starting to dig down a little bit. What I found is the best thing to do at this point in time is to stop, loosen back the clamps, kind of move them out of our way, spin the piece of stock around, come back in from the other side, find a new piece of our backing board here, line this up again, and there we are. Clamp everything back in place. Lock everything down. And start making the other shoulder cut. And the reason for that is otherwise the 7/16 inch iron gets stuck right in the 7/16 inch track, and it really starts to bind in there. Switching this around will give us a little bit more room in the cut. So we'll go ahead and make this side of the scoring cut. And we're just going to work down to our full depth. We might reverse it around one or two more times. One of the things I've noticed is that you'll get some chip buildup here inside the fence. So trying to keep that clean is important. But essentially this is the way that we're going to make this cut across the grain. A couple of key things here. You want to be careful on the front end of the cut. You don't dip the plane down. You will dig out the front end of the cut. You're pretty much protected on the back end of the cut by this backer piece, so you don't have to worry about that too much. If you try and make a cut in narrow stock, the plane will really suffer because of that rocking action. This piece right here is about 4.5 inches. I had tried to make cuts with smaller pieces and unsuccessfully. So you want to give yourself a good wide base. You could probably, if you have a narrow piece, have a starter block and then this backer block here, and that'll help you control the cut all the way across. But I'm going to go ahead and continue to work on this cut and work down to my final depth, and we'll take a look at the cut at that point in time. Now the more you switch this around going back and forth, the less this spacer block seems to matter. The plane is going to ride in the cut that you've started anyway. I still like to keep it accurate, and you can see that this has been just a tremendous amount of work going back and forth. Why do I do this? I'll show you in a minute, but the quality of cut, if you don't take this kind of care, it's going to be pretty poor and pretty uneven in my experience. Now, maybe some of that's the craftsman and the technique. I'm not saying that's not the case, but in any case, this does eventually, at the end of all of that, produce a quality cut. So when we get done, there is our consistent sliding dovetail joint. I found that there is really a need to move back and forth, rotating the stock around and around and around. If you don't do that, the quality of the joint that you get, the quality of this dado cut, seems to be pretty bad. Even with all of that, we could probably touch this joint up a little bit with a chisel to make sure that it's clean. Just get a nice paring chisel and touch that up. But for now, we'll go ahead and move on to the next cut in this, which is making the tail cut with the plane. So we have to switch the plane over, and then we'll make the tail cut. Okay, we're back over at the bench, ready to switch this plane over to make the tail cut. And we're going to need the wider iron, the 2 fence rods, the square fence. We'll want some setup instructions here, and then, of course, the piece of the plane that we were just working with. So, first thing to do is to take off the bevel fence. Set that aside for just a second. Take out the smaller iron. Set that aside. And now we have to take off this spur block because it is no longer needed. So we'll go ahead and do that. We're going to set this aside. Now you can see why these screws often go missing, because we're done with the spur block. And unless we put these little screws back on the block itself, and they are little and delicate, we'll probably lose them. I certainly have a tendency to lose them in my shop, so we'll go ahead and set those aside. Alright, so we're back to the base. First thing to do, install these fence rods. There's 2 spots to install them, high and low. I don't know what the difference is. I keep using the high set of holes, and they will go on the right side of the plane as I'm looking at it from back here. So they'll go on this side of the plane. I'm going to make this look easy. This takes a while to figure out. The next step, let's go ahead and tighten this depth gauge down. We won't need it for this cut, but we don't want to lose it. The next step is to attach this fence, the bevel fence, but now with the bevel piece facing up and out of the way, we're essentially turning this into a square fence, sliding it onto the rods. Slight problem here. Sliding it onto the rods. There we go. That's better. These thumb screws out of the way. There we go. Now, here comes our first measurement. We made our cut here 3/8 of an inch deep. So get my small ruler, make sure that's the case. So 1/8, 2/8, 3/8. Yeah, we're at 3/8 all the way across. So what we're going to want to do here is set the distance from this spur to this fence at that same 3/8 inch. And we'll only get one chance to do this right. And if we don't get the measurement right, then our joint won't fit. So there's 3/8 inch on that end and 3/8 inch back here. And we'll tighten our screws down. There's the 3/8 inch that we need, matching the depth of this dado cut. So the difference between here and the spur block is the depth of this cut. I like to put that fence in first, then come in and set our iron in place. And this is the widest iron. So a couple interesting things about this. You could see from the sharpening that Stanley hollow ground this iron. So only the tip and the back edge are sharp. And they actually hollow ground the back, so only the outside edges are sharp. But we'll go ahead and put that in the plane, coming in from the side. Now this often happens. It gets stuck, and Stanley provided this little piece here and on the other side to kind of pull the iron holder out of the way. So it's just this little piece here, it sticks out on the other side. You can pull that out of the way. Again, we're going to make a fairly aggressive cut. So we'll dial this in here on a scrap piece, but we want to make sure it's fairly aggressive, parallel to this side of the iron, even with that nicker. And we're only, as you can see, only going to use a portion of this blade to make this cut. Let's clamp that down. And then this fence is going to ride on this knob again, so we'll need to loosen up the depth stop, slide it across and get it on there, just like the other fence. There it goes. Swing the depth stop around and set it into place. Now, Stanley tells us that for our joint, if we had cut 7/16 across, our shoulder would be 5/32 inch on either side, and that's what we would need to set this depth stop at, is 5/32. That's a problem because the scale is not in 30 seconds, so we'd have a hard time finding it. But fortunately, we changed the dimensions of the cut a little bit, and we actually made ours 1/2 inch across, which means that we need to have this set at 1/8 of an inch to take off the shoulders on either side. Now, just like a piece of machinery that we would use, we're actually going to dial in this depth of cut to make sure it's exact. So we're actually going to set it a little bit short of 1/8 to begin with and see how that works. And if we don't like it, then we can make it deeper later, and that won't affect the geometry of the cut at all. So we'll actually set this a little bit short of 1/8 inch on the scale. And you can see again why, if these scales are missing, you can't use the plane. All right, so that's the plane set up. But much like before, this fence is going to ride up and down to regulate the depth of cut. This will ride against the edge of the stock. So when we have our final stock, we're going to cut across the grain like this again. So you're going to see we're going to want to make that same 3/8 inch scoring cut. Even though we have the one nicker here, we're going to want to make sure the quality is good, and then we got to watch for blowout on the back side again. So that is the plane set up to make the second cut. We can set the other pieces and parts aside. Let's go back over to the fixture, clamp our mating piece, which is this one here, in place, and we'll go ahead and make that tail cut to fit in the data that we cut earlier. We're back over to the fixture now. We've clamped our piece into place. We've gone ahead and scored a line here at that 3/8 inch depth of cut. We're going to run the plane across to make the tail cut. I like to have the piece of wood hanging a little bit over the edge here, stay out of the way of the fences. There's a lot more clamping options and a lot more options with this one. We don't have any fence or anything that we need to build into the fixture, so you could clamp this in any number of places. I've just done it here for convenience. It works out. And what we're going to do is just go ahead and run this plane across and start defining the tail of the cut. And the plane will bottom out pretty quickly, and we can just switch the piece of stock over and cut the other side. Alright, I've gone ahead and flipped the stock over, and we're going to go ahead and make the second part of this cut. I'm going to give you a tip or a trick here too. So let's go ahead and get this sorted. Okay, so the tip or trick, the plane will often start to do this. It's bottoming out, it's not making the cut. And now you can see from the cut that we're not down to the full depth. What's going on here? Why will this plane refuse to cut any deeper when it looks like I've got to go another, 32nd of an inch? Why does it just seem to be riding across? The answer is that this nicker, which sits proud of the fence, is not as sharp as it needs to be. I need to take this to the sharpening station and sharpen that nicker up. And it is not digging into the wood the way it should, and so it's keeping the blade and the fence proud of the material. That's not a problem when I start because I had scored the line with my marking knife. So here's the trick. If you run into this and you haven't got a chance to start yet with the sharpening, you can take your marking knife and just go ahead and mark across where the scoring iron will go. And then you can bring your plane back to the stock and continue to cut. There it goes. All right, we are down to the final depth of cut. So let's pull this out of the jig and take a look at this dovetail that we've formed with the plane. So here it is, cut across there. Now comes the final proof. Through all of that, did we get a good dovetail joint? So bring over our first piece of stock here, and let's go ahead and see if they fit at all. And it looks like, oh yeah, it fits very tightly. And once I put this in here, it's not going to come out. So let's get the persuader. Thank God this isn't fine furniture. We probably would have made the dovetail joint just a little bit tighter. But there it is. Fit into place. A quality dovetail joint with the Stanley 444 plane. It's tight. It's not moving. We dress that up with a plane. It'll look really good. I was tired. I just wanted to bang on something here at the end of the video. But that is the Stanley 444 dovetail plane. You can make a decent quality joint with it, which is nice. It is a lot of work to get done. I'm going to move back over and give you some of my final thoughts on this plane. All right. After all that fussing and fighting, we came back and we cleaned up the joint here at the bench with the hand plane. Just showing you the end of that process. Let's take a look at it on close up. So there it is, the joint we were able to make in this Stanley plane. It's pretty darn good. You can see we're a hair off on the shoulder. So we've got a little bit of a gap on that side and a little bit of the gap on this side. Still got some hair on there that I need to clean up. But overall, the joint is pretty darn tight, and it certainly is not going to move. Before I did all of that, one of my setup pieces, one of my first cuts, actually probably my third or fourth cut was this one. So here's pine and walnut for contrast. And you could see the gap here, the gap there, and the gap over here. This joint nowhere near as clean as the other one. Shoulder was a little bit better, but didn't fit the joint as tight and as clean as that one. That's why I go through all those steps. I wanted to get a better quality cut. A little look of what it was. Alright, so that's my review and use of the Stanley 444 dovetail plane. Some final thoughts. The plane is awkward to use. You probably saw me throughout the video struggling to find a place to get the correct handhold to keep the balance of the plane correct. Whether it was the grooving cut or the tail cut, either one, it's very difficult to keep this plane square. I think also sharpening the irons is going to be a challenge. It's a tricky plane to use. I keep trying to find techniques that'll make it more production worthy, where I can use it to actually make a fine piece of furniture. But the truth is that if I had to make a sliding dovetail joint, I'd probably cut the groove with a saw and use chisels. And maybe a router plane to clean up the bottom of that. I've done it before, works out well. And if I had to make the tails and I wanted to be fancy, I can get something like this dovetail plane. Pretty straightforward. This will make the tails for you. Here's the fence for depth. Here's the fence for how wide you want the dovetails. And this is a beauty to use. I use this one. I have and I will again. It's really nice. The Stanley Plane, despite my best efforts to this time, is just not going to be a user. I wanted to prove that with the right kind of setup, the right kind of information, the right kind of prep, the Stanley tool would be a good one to use, but I've got to reach the conclusion so many others have. This is just a difficult plane to use. The moving fence is an interesting idea, but it's not a great design. The rocking back and forth, the fact that it's a little bit loose, all makes it difficult to use. The amount of changeover that you've got to do from step to step is pretty amazing. There's a couple things I do by hand that I didn't think about doing here, which is when I make these sliding dovetails, and you saw it when I was pounding this together, you actually make it a little bit wider in the back, and you get the finish right on the front of your piece, so it actually slides in a little easier. Not a lot, maybe a 64th over the entire length of the groove, but you just kind of know to do it, and it'll go in easier. You can do that with chisels without thinking about it too much. With the plane, I probably would have adjusted the fence a little bit to make that cut if I wanted to do it right, and it would have slid in or easier. All in all, I could see why these sit on the shelf. That's where this one's going. It's going to go right up there on the shelf. It'll probably sit up there until I decide to do something with it later on. I've got other tools that sit on the shelf in here. Maybe I should think about their long-term disposition. That's my review and thoughts on the Stanley 444. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, please either send me post something next to this video or send me a direct message on Facebook if you're one of my woodworking tools groups, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks for watching my video.